Welcome to Upthinking Finance, a podcast that offers a unique and discerning view of economics and financial planning. Here is your host, Emerson Fersch.
Welcome to another episode of Upthinking Finance. Israeli economist Itzhak Adizes once said, "Some people have something to say. Some people have to say something. Avoid the second group." Now, starting a business and building a company is challenging, it's exciting, and for me, it's been one of the more spiritual experiences I've had in my life. Between the clients I've met who've trusted me with their family wealth, but not only that, what they've brought to my life and how they've influenced me to be a better person, more involved in my community, be a better husband and father. It's been just, I cannot deny the hand of God in my work in Capital Investment Advisors, and that also speaks to the people I serve with, who I've worked with a lot of good people over the years, but the team that I have now is some of the best people I could ever hope to collaborate with on a daily basis. But there's a lot that can go wrong starting a business, just taking an idea from our mind and then successfully turning it into something that not only can generate revenue, which I think is just kind of a short-sighted goal, but something can actually make a difference in people's lives. There's a lot that can go wrong. I mean, I started off with a partner when I first left the bank back in the mid-90s, and that lasted a year, and then we just weren't on the same page, and then I got involved in another kind of a partnership situation a few years later, and those were situations that just didn't work out that great, but you learn and you move on. And that's the thing with business, is that you can perhaps get to a point where you feel like everything is exactly where you want it, but it's very difficult. There's still work to do to keep it there. We never get to rest on our laurels as business owners, because if we get too complacent, we become like a lot of organizations are today, and some that I've been involved with that have a population of people that are just content to keep doing things the same way over and over again. That we've always done it this way, and eventually just lose sight of really why they're there. There's a scripture, Proverbs 29:18, where there is no vision, the people perish. And to me, at least in the business world, it's important to constantly reevaluate and reassess and make sure that we're fresh, I guess is the word. We're hitting the mark, that we're not just relying on the same thing day after day, week after week, year after year. And so it's a process. Today's guest is with a company that specializes in change management, Adizes International. His name is Sunil Dovedy. He oversees the professional practices of the Adizes Institute in the Americas and India, with special emphasis on program delivery quality. He brings to the Adizes organization an MBA from the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, and he earned a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the Indian Institute of Technology in Varanasi. He recently relocated to Colorado after having spent a number of years down in Monterrey, Mexico, and he's married with 3 children. So it's my pleasure to welcome today Sunil Dovedy, who's coming to us today from Morrison, Colorado. Sunil, thanks for joining me today on Upthinking Finance.
Great to be here, Emerson, and looking forward to what we can see unfolding.
I guess the best place to start would be to explain what Adizes is to the listeners. I know enough to be dangerous, and you're the expert, so.
Well, I don't know. I think I'm still a novice, even though I've been at it for 2 decades. So just a bit of history. I used to be in the software field for the longest of time, 20 odd years. And then through a series of circumstances, ran into this gentleman, Dr. Adizes, who's based in Santa Barbara, and we've lived in Santa Barbara for a long time. And he showed up in our lives, and he's one of these people on earth that you come across once in a while, and if you do, it's a privilege. He's definitely a gifted individual, and what is his contribution to the world, I think, is how to simplify the process of management. And he's taken typical management thinking. People go get their MBAs and all that good stuff, but how do you simplify it so that even the person who doesn't have an educational degree can get it? And I think that's his gift, is how do you take common sense principles and apply them to the management game. And I ran across him in 1997, And we, as a company, applied the principles, and I was blown away because I said, this is too good to keep a secret. And then in 1999, I joined him on a crusade. So, in a sense, we are sort of missionaries trying to transform how management is practiced and taught. Because very often the way people think of management it's pretty 19th century, and the 21st century. You need some other techniques, and hopefully we'll touch upon that as we go along. But I give a tremendous amount of credit to Dr. Adizes. He's been a guide, a teacher, and a mentor, and it's been a wonderful journey for the last 20 odd years.
Well, as you know, you met my wife Darcy, who's been a guest on this podcast, and that's where I got connected to you ultimately, but to Adizes and the thinking. And I went to Breakthrough to Prime. Gosh, probably 7, 8 years ago, I think now, up at the location there in Cupertino, and no, I found it. It's as you said. There's a logic to it and a depth to it. I'm self-employed now, and I can tell you, just listening to you explain about management. I mean, all I was ever exposed to in life was command and control and intimidation. So either you're going to cower and accept it, or you're going to branch off and do your own thing, and hopefully not treat people that way. So anyhow, the medieval style, I guess you might say. So would it be good? Because I think the foundation of this is that life cycle, and I would like to share that with the listeners. For those of you who are not watching on YouTube, I'd encourage you to take time to see it, because this is really kind of the foundation. Is that a fair way to put it for this management thinking in terms of how you have to adjust and adapt?
Yeah, I think that's one of the core principles, and I think it's as good a place to start, Emerson, as any. What is a life cycle? I think all of us experience life cycles all all the time. Things are born, they grow, they age, and they die. And what Dr. Adizes along the way in his travels discovered that very similar to the human life cycle. You have a baby, infant, toddler, or the terrible twos as we call it, and then the teenager years. Then you get into the adult stage, middle age, and eventually, you sit back and start reaping the benefits of what you've actually built, and then you know get to some comfortable location, and when you get old, you sometimes move back with the kids, and eventually we all die. So again, nothing dramatic about this, but this is also true of any other systems like stars or trees and animals. They all typically follow a life cycle, and so do any organization. And if you go to the next slide, Emerson, there's the thing called the corporate life cycle, which is the Adizes corporate life cycle. And here you go through these different 10 stages. It starts with the courtship you have an idea, and you have a gleam in your eye and say, oh, I can go change the world with this particular thing that I have. And then the organization is born. It goes through a birth stage, getting into infancy, and you go from dreaming to doing. And it's like when a kid gets born in the family, you the sleepless nights, and there's all kinds of things that are needed. And for the baby to really have a successful infancy, it needs two things. It needs love and milk. In the case of an organization, the love is the commitment of the founding members, and milk is cash flow. So those are the things that keep it alive. And then as it goes on, again, and long hours. Typically, when you look at infant organizations, they are working long hours, and I mean, 20 hours a day is pretty typical. And people say, can you get a life? And the life is taking care of the baby. And then eventually the customers, if all goes well, the customers start coming back, cash flow gets positive, and then you get into this go-go phase where, overnight almost you go from this rags to riches kind of a state where, and it's very heady times because people told you, oh, it's tough, and you can't make it, and eventually you make it. And this go-go is, the market is accepting what you have, the money is flowing in. But the challenge with go-go is that life is so good that you don't have the necessary controls in place. So you don't really know whether you're making money, losing money. But and very often when we talk to go-go organizations, we ask them how are you doing, and they'll always talk, we sold so much, or we have so much market share. They always think in terms of the top line or the revenue rather than looking at the whole system. And eventually, what happens is the lack of controls catch up, and then the organization is then it transitions into the stage of adolescence where you need to start looking at making sure less is more, because in go-go everything is you chase everything. It's like a 2-year-old. They put their finger in any kind of thing that's interesting, and the same thing is true for a go-go organization. And adolescence, certain controls come into place, and you start, taking away the customers that don't really give you as much profitability, or you don't have, or you just have, you have to prune the organization. It's like a tree has to be pruned. It's a bush. It's a bush that grows in different directions, and the energy has to be refocused, and that's what happens in adolescence. And then you have prime. Prime is the place where you're in a really good place where there's a balance between flexibility and control, where you're able to make changes and also control the organization. And post prime, there's this gray zone, as you can see in the slide. It ends up in this zone of it gets to the fall where all the excitement. So you have this rocket ship that's going, and the momentum of the rocket ship takes you to the top, and then eventually, if you don't sustain that energy that took you to the place called prime, it eventually starts to fall. And the organization is still very strong. It's got healthy cash flow. Customers are still coming and buying what you have, but the excitement is starting to wane. And eventually, as you move to the right side of the curve or the red part of the curve, you move more from adding value to the marketplace to protecting the gains. And that's typically what happens in aristocracy. You start accumulating wealth and financial wealth, and people come and say, "Oh, I got so much cash in the bank." And well, the question is that a good thing or a bad thing? And many times in aristocracy, the typical thing you hear is, "Oh, we beat our budgets." Well, in our vernacular, it's that is not such a good thing. Beating budgets doesn't mean you're doing well, because you just set your budgets too low. There's no stretching, so the organization starts to get comfortable, and eventually that catches up with you, and then you're not as relevant anymore in the marketplace, and then it starts, the people start to turn upon each other, and there's a age of recrimination. There's infighting and who caused the problem, but the problem was caused just past the prime when you stopped having that energy to fuel the rocket ship. And then eventually there's another discontinuity, this zigzag that you can see in the curve, is when you put it on artificial life support, and it becomes a bureaucracy, because for whatever reason you need to sustain the business. Maybe it's too big to fail or whatever. And then eventually you pull the plug when when all is said and done, and the plug is pulled and the organization dies. So those are the 10 stages in summary of the life cycle. And there are some early exits, as you can see. From courtship, you can go to an affair. If the risk is not undertaken, if something doesn't get born, then it was just an idea. Or you have infant mortality, which is from infancy. These are the shortcuts to the aging or dying side. And from go-go, there's a thing called the founders of family trap, where the organization doesn't really get institutionalized and managed by a different set of people, and the founder or the family controls it. And then when the founder or the family passes on, the organization also dies. And in adolescence, there's typically a fight that takes place, between, because there's a time where the outgoing side and the inside, you want more controls because you don't have them till the go-go stage, and trying to insert those controls as well as the you know, staying relevant to the market. That tension causes challenges to come in, and this can be seen in many organizations. And I think the most prominent ones, you already know. So, and a classic example is Apple. Steve Jobs and Wozniak started that. And they went through the courtship, infancy, and then Steve Jobs took it to the go-go stage, and then he hired Scully from Pepsi, I think, and his famous quote was, "Do you want to change the world, or you want to still sell sugar water?" So he hired Scully, but then there was a fight between Scully and Jobs, and Scully, he went and created an alliance with the board because Jobs was this so-called unguided missile, according to Scully, and he was coming up with new ideas, and Scully was trying to put in the controls, and that created a fight, which caused the separation, and then Jobs was kicked out, if you can remember. But Jobs went and started up other things like Next and Pixar, and then came back to Apple. But as Scully took over, if you follow the life cycle, there was a aging sense. There was no The excitement was not there. They started making more profits, but the excitement was not there, and they went into premature aging. And then Jobs got back, and then we see Apple. He reignited Apple to give it the life it has today. So that's an example of how this life cycle sort of works. But you can see this happening in, how do we say, in many contexts.
I love this because I've had a chance to implement this in different ways, and there's a number of questions because, as you said, it applies to business. It's kind of I don't know what the word is, organic, but even in relationships. And so, and you see these. I've experienced this in working with clients. In church, and I was thinking, I'm reading a book called "The Death or the Myth of Capitalism," and one of the things it talks about is it's kind of a side thing, but these big companies have decided they'd rather not compete with each other. They'd rather just become oligopolies and coexist. But one of the interesting things it was just what you said was that they're spending they spend millions and billions of dollars, I guess, on research and development, but as a percentage of their revenues, it's like nothing. And so there's no innovation, there's no change, and I remember learning at the top, the fall begins when you lose vision, and so where the profit becomes the means to the end rather than, as you said earlier, changing the world. So here, one question I'd like to ask is, how do you take an organization that's already surpassed the prime and then pull it back? Because it's almost like a momentum that gets set in when you're going through all these processes, which are all pitfalls. I mean, it's like this thing could blow up really at any time for a bunch of reasons. And then you get this company to that sweet spot. But then you get to that top where all of a sudden, I always equate it to resting on your laurels, just standing pat. This is the way we've always done it. All that stuff that just makes me want to heave. Anybody that throws that, well, this is the way it's always been done. That's like a red flag. Just turn and run. But how do you pull it back?
So the first benefit really of this life cycle, I keep asking people when I show this, what is the purpose? Who cares if this thing exists or doesn't exist? And this is a very important diagnostic tool, Emerson. Knowing where you are is very important. And the other piece is the leadership style, let's go back to families and parenting. The way you parent for an infant and the way you parent for a 2-year-old, which is the go-go, and the way you parent for an adolescent is totally different. And knowing how to shift your leadership and parenting style is critical. So knowing where you are at any point in time, there are always three options. So let's say you find yourself in aristocracy. So option one is you can try and claw your way back to prime. So that is a path. Option two is let it just continue the normal flow and go downwards to death. Or you can actually trigger a new life cycle. So imagine another life cycle being born from aristocracy, where you start a new life from that stage. Because many times aristocracy organizations have the capability to start it, but they have to almost jettison their beliefs and other pieces of the puzzle. And a good example of this could be, you can also, by the way, apply this to countries. And originally I'm from India, and when I left India in the late 70s, early 80s, India was clearly in the recrimination bureaucracy zone. But if you look at India right now, India is definitely more in a go-go stage where they've, if you look at all the software, it's number one in the software development. So there were certain things they did which allowed it to start up a new life cycle. So there's a vibrancy around it. So knowing where you are, you can actually figure out the three options that you always have. So in GoGo, you have, if you suppose you're in GoGo, you have three options too. You can claw your way up to prime, or you can go into the founder's trap, or you can slide back to infancy. This is a dynamic thing. It's not a question of once you get to a certain stage, you'll be there, because the biggest problem or the biggest challenge in prime is to first getting to prime, and the bigger challenge is staying in prime because you will shift. So this is a and the way we look at this is not how big the organization is in terms of its size or chronological age. It's how is the organization behaving? Because we've seen organizations that are, you know, 50 years, 50 years chronologically, but they're still in a go-go stage. In fact, we had one client which was $10 billion in revenue, and they were still in go-go. They were acting like 2-year-olds. So it's not your revenue or your size or age. And there's organizations that are 5 years old, but they are aging, and you can feel them, heavy. So the trick is to understand where you are, and then once you're there, then get a consciousness saying, okay, if this is where I am, I can move to the next stage. And the other beauty of this, Emerson, is that at every stage you're going to have issues. I mean, problems are part of life, but the trick is which problems should you address? And a simple way of understanding this is if I tell you my child wakes up at 2 in the morning, cries, and wets its bed. I mean, is that a problem I need to solve? And the only answer to that is another question, which is how old is the child? If the child's a 6-month infant, leave it alone. But if it's a 29-year-old son of mine, I better I better solve that problem. So it's age dependent.
Well, let me ask you this, because here's a thought, and this is kind of related to my firm, and there's, I guess, kind of two different directions. Maybe I'm simplifying it. People go when you run a financial planning firm. One is, and a lot of guys like to go big and have, a lot of reps and have these big organizations with all these different people and huge revenues. Although, and then there's kind of which the path I've chosen, which is a smaller one. There's four of us in the office. We manage a more modest amount of money because the priorities are more to be able to have more face time with clients. A lot of the things that seem to be getting lost in business today, particularly as organizations get bigger, the principals lose touch with the clients and even with staff. And my point is I guess I've always viewed more people as more variables, as more problems. I'm wondering if you were to summarize where to your point, what problems do you spend more time solving in this process? I'd submit, I think it's personalities and people and resistance to change, but maybe there's something else. So I'd be curious on your insight on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's definitely, as you add complexity with number of people, there's so many more hearts, heads, hands that are flying around, and each of them have their own families and their own interests, and as people evolve and grow, and because our priorities are even our what is important in life changes too as individuals. So even individuals, we have a life cycle, and there is in fact, I was very moved by this book which I read when I was in college. It was very idealistic, and it's by Schumacher, and it's "Small is Beautiful" was the title, and he's written three books, Good Work, Small is Beautiful, and then A Guide for the Perplexed. And he's an economist, but basically his subtitle of his Small is Beautiful book is Economics as if People Matter. So how do you right size? And there's, I think, even though he wrote it in the 70s, I think it's so relevant even for today's context. And many times when we work with organizations, the key thing we try and do is to create a structure or an ecosystem where exactly you simulate this smallness, because at the end of the day, your heart has to engage. If you don't engage the heart, and if you just make it a mind thing or a mechanical thing, you're going to become irrelevant and it's going to calcify. And even large organizations, if you think of an organization like Toyota, for instance, and they have these great systems and then the Japanese way of, any worker can stop the line, and there was a value system in place, but even that over time gets calcified. So I don't know if you remember, there was Oh gosh, actually, we had the experience because there was this incident about sudden acceleration in Toyota cars. Now, Toyota cars are known to be safe and well manufactured, but there was this thing where, uh, and even though they knew internally that this defect existed, they couldn't block and stop the line. So even with all their systems, it started to calcify, and people died. And there was an acceleration thing. Now they still don't know exactly what the cause and effect was, but there was something which caused sudden acceleration where you lost control over your car. And and even with the best system and the best way, you tend to and then what typically happens is we get sidetracked by the profit motive sometimes, and so this is going to cost too much, or we tend to ignore things and we hope for the best. So but that's part of life, I think, too, and we go through these waves. But I think what you've chosen to do is really have a team that's integrated, that that works together and feels for each other. So and then you can add good value to your clients, as opposed to and you don't have to have the best products or the best offerings, but I think at the end of the day, most people are looking for a certain, a certain relationship, I think, and that definitely is coming in no uncertain terms, despite what's happening in the US right now. I feel there's a shift happening where we are going to get back to some of the basics, Emerson.
You're right. And it's funny because we've in our office had conversations about, it's not just work, it's people, as you said. And how do we best I guess, have a thoroughness or a consistency in everything? We redid our branding. One of my clients, who's a graphic design person, pointed out that our logo didn't really align with our personalities. The energy that we have in our office. And once we did that, it also then started to broaden out into, we're a small, it was like an awareness, I guess, of who we are, who our clients are, what the expectation is, how we want to represent ourselves. A lot of things I never really thought about, consciously. It was always kind of there. But what's interesting is, to your point, is we're meeting people now. Clients are coming to us, and it's not like I'm advertising this new image or whatever, but people are being drawn to the fact that we are shunning doing business with certain types of companies, that we are consistent. We're small. We're trying to deal with firms that maybe are more nichey like we are, and but that's what's happened. It's just like, kind of, what is that thing from that movie? If you build it, they will come, and that's sort of kind of Field of Dreams. That's kind of what's happening. And so it's been very reaffirming, I guess, is maybe the point. And so I look at the chart and I think, well, where are we? And I feel in many ways we're kind of as big as we want, but the dynamics of our client base is changing somewhat. But our attitude is, I don't know, I like to think we're at a prime spot. I don't think we'll ever get too big. My concern is always just getting stale as as an advisor. I never want to be that guy who's sitting at my desk, when I'm 80, doing the same old thing. And thankfully, in the last 2 years, a lot of things of my outlook on things has shifted. I've opened my mind to things that 5 years ago or even 3 years ago I wouldn't even have made time for people. And as a result, there's an energy that's been built back into to what we're doing, which is obviously benefiting clients, but it's infiltrated the firm. Does that make sense? How I'm explaining that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the key, uh, it goes back to, if you go back to the origin of the Olympics, when the Greeks, it's about the inside. If the inside is strong and vibrant, it doesn't make a difference what the outside is. If you're integrated in the inside, and if you love what you do, that's going to exude it. And it's not a matter of size, it's about quality. And I think that's what everybody is I think yearning for. We might have gotten lost with all this, globalization and supply chains and efficiencies, and let's get the cheapest cost. But people are willing to, no, I shouldn't say pay more, but I think they pay for value. And what do you value? You don't, and plus, if you look at the the total cost of doing business, we sometimes ignore the true costs. For example, cost of because we don't add in the costs of how much our pollution costs, or how much there are certain things that we're taking for granted, and we're using certain assets which we assume are free, but they're not really free. And I think the consciousness is shifting, especially in the younger generations, Emerson, that they are not going to let you get away with just you know so-called cheaper price because you didn't account your price is cheap because you didn't account for some of the benefits that you assume for free, but you didn't actually return the asset back to the system. So whether it's air, land, water, mineral assets, all these things are I think coming into the calculation, which I think is at one level you can say, oh goodness, this is going to be bad news, but I think it's going to be good news in the long run because we are going to become more simple and much more elegant.
I've always thought things kind of move in extremes. I mean, in our industry, you have this ESG thing, which is kind of mandated, at least in my opinion, extremes of what you're talking about. And then there's the other side, which is, like you got said, also the bottom line, but somewhere in the middle. And I see this manifest with the people I work with. Money, financial remuneration and reward for work done is part of it, but there's also this balance. There's this flexibility of schedule. There's other things that kind of people are looking for as they build out their life. And it's same thing with clients. Darcy, talks about, what we're doing is building experiences. We want to have experiences with people, versus just this cold transactional thing. And so I feel like we've done really well with that in terms of having, personal relationships. So let me shift gears because here's one that I think I'd really like to ask you to speak to, which is the family business. And I've had some experiences with this with clients, and family and money, I will tell you, just full disclosure, it can be really great or it can just be horrible. I mean, I've known people, who've sued, siblings have sued each other over, perceived slights on, how much inheritances they've had. I mean, I've had people come in who literally were angry because their deceased mother left 10 grand to somebody who was taking care of them, who wasn't a family member. I mean, the stories of that could go on. And so then you get into business. And I'd really just love if you can share, because to me, there's a bunch of potholes on this life cycle where things can blow up, but that's one that I think probably has the most complications of any of them in my mind. And so if you don't mind just elaborating on some experience, some thoughts, I think this would be really interesting.
Sure, sure. I think this is so. The good news is I didn't realize I was going to get into this space, but in the last 2 decades, I think 90% of our clients that I deal with are family-owned businesses, and you're right. I think there's a lot of I mean, at some point you're looking at, you're building this beautiful thing, and then suddenly two siblings are fighting over, your wife is using the chauffeur more than my wife, so I mean, it's just ridiculous. So
Yeah.
and some of these things, and I mean, the most minute things, and but you're totally right. It's about these So if you don't mind, just let's if you there's a slide I put together for this concept. If you can shift it to the next one, and there's a thing called the three-circle model, and these life cycles are in play, and it gets complex a bit because you have the business side of the business is one thing, and you got the family, which also has a life cycle, and the third piece that will pop up, Emerson, is this thing called ownership. So these three things create some very interesting dynamics. And this, by the way, the credit for this goes to there's a group of people, John Davies and company, that they put together these three things. And on purpose, I've colored these circles, family being green, the business being red, and ownership being blue. And if you look at right in the center of this Mickey Mouse diagram, so to say, is zone one, where you have family members who own the business and are also managing the business. So that's a very typical state of being. But then you also have family members that are also employees but are not owners, and that's zone two. So that's a little legend on the right. And zone three are you have non-family people in the business, but they also are owners. So you've got three different constellations that are in the business. And then four and five really are there's family owners, but they're not in the business, and other owners that are not in the business, because many times you need other financing and you have partners that come into play. So there's and what essentially what this is showing is that you can see the level of interest. There's multiple interests that are being activated, and each of them have their own way of life. So if it was just a family, imagine if all the ownership was in the family, it would reduce the complexity. But that very often is never the case, because you always need some other partner to come along and finance the business. And then I think zone six and seven are very interesting. So six is basically people who are working in the business, but they are not owners, and they are employees and managers. They're not owners and they're not family. And then there's zone seven. Well, but they basically control your destiny in a sense, because they are the ones you rely on to get things done. So if you don't integrate them, and this is back to the thing we started with, you can't go and whip them around. These are not horses. In fact, Dr. Adizes was he was going through this definition of what is management, and in many languages the word management doesn't exist, and in Spanish the closest word that comes to management is called manejar. Manejar is used in the context of handling horses or driving cars. So, so you can see the old linkages to the words, but management has evolved, and it has to be more. You can't treat a human like a horse or a car and drive them. And that's really many of our management elements is top down. Lead them. It's always this top down stuff, but the world is too complex, and you have to do this. You have to engage them in a different way, so that because they have a life, they have a heart, they have a family, and how do you integrate that piece of the puzzle? And I'm sure if you look at your own context, Emerson, the business you've built, some of the people may not be partners or owners, but they almost act like family. So even though they are outside the family, they become very close to you in no uncertain terms. And then there's family members who are not in the business, but they have tremendous influence. And I remember the situation once. There was this Australian family that come to. They were having some trouble, and three brothers and a father, and we'd get together and make some agreements, and then it was everybody shook hands, and then they would go away, and the next morning it was as if the yesterday's conversation never happened. So there was agreement the night before, but the next morning everything was falling apart, because there was the pillow talk that happened with the spouses, and the spouses have such influence. Even they're not in the business, they actually can dictate many things. So there's people who are not directly involved in the business, but they are driving the show.
The one you were mentioning about the non-family, or the family, the uninvolved second party, the spouse, or the invariably it's whether it's involving an inheritance situation or business. There's always it's usually the family. You actually identified the point. It's that outsider that's connected through marriage or some other thing that is invariably the one stirring the pot. That is, I've observed that constant, and then they get the one spouse riled up, and then you get the problem starting, and it's unfortunate.
At one level, it's unfortunate, but on the other side, if we know the phenomenon, I think that's the advantage of the Adizes game, is if you know this phenomenon exists, you can inoculate against it. I think that's the work we do, which is we have the medicine or the inoculation to be able to not to not prevent this, because we know it's going to happen. And if you can predict it and use that energy, because conflict, for example, if there's noise in the system, it's energy. And if we can harness that energy somehow and make it constructive, that's what makes this so much more invigorating and fun. So yes, at one level we can say, why is this person, poking their nose in this business, but that's the reality. So if we recognize the reality and use it to our advantage, because they have some needs too, they're doing it for a reason. And one of the things that happens is that each of these three circles operate with different vibrations. And maybe before we go to the next piece of the puzzle, Emerson, I think the key is not to isolate this and say, and in the past, there was this saying about, business is business and personal is personal. Don't let the two mix. And we're saying, no, everything is personal and everything is business in this context. So don't try to compartmentalize it because it's a false starting assumption. But let's leverage that and use it to our advantage. And one other piece of the puzzle which might shed some light is if we can go to the next graphic, Emerson, that will give us. So if you remember, green was the family circle, blue was the ownership circle, and red was the business circle. And each of them have different dimensions that impact each circle. So for example, if you look at the time horizons, which is this horizontal line, the time horizon for a business, if you look at their planning and how they do planning, typically it's about a 3 to 5 year. I mean, 5 years is becoming even more rare now, but 3 years is pretty typical. That's their time horizon. But if you look at the family time horizon, if families do plan, most families last for at least 3 generations, and 3 generations is 100 years. So if you imagine just the difference in how the business thinks and how the family thinks, you've got there's a time horizon mismatch, so to say, because 100 years you can do a lot of good or you can do a lot of damage, and 3 years is typically the cycle for a business. And in terms of the consciousness and values, the business is really based on more on meritocracy. Let's make things happen. Let's add value to the marketplace. But the family system, which is the green system, is more egalitarian, equal rights. So just the way in which decisions get made are different, and that creates a lot of tension. And the ownership thing is more about rules based. This is the rule, this is the law, therefore we're going to follow that. So that's the blue system, for instance. And in the family side, because even as you rightly said, there's a will which has everything documented, but then the green system will try and upend that, which because they say that's their version of fairness has got their own definition. And then in terms of the expansion and contraction of wealth assets, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say wealth, I should say financial assets. So the business can expand and contract very rapidly, but the family system is more conservative and it shrinks and expands at a different pace. So all of these dimensions tend to 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 create conflict, and these are the subterranean pieces. And even though people are behaving a certain way, I think they're triggered by some of these elements, their values, for instance, where they are, the time horizons, and then the fear or the anxiety that might come in terms of risk taking or risk aversion. But at the end of the day, I think if you look at what is family wealth, at least I've come to learn the following. Family wealth, yes, there has to be financial elements to it, but there's financial capital. There's also intellectual capital. As you look at the family and in its evolution, it's evolving and they grow intellectually. There's also human capital. They've got muscle, and you can trust the family because there's tremendous trust because they share a certain thing. Versus if you hire somebody from the outside, building up that trust might require a little bit more doing, and you may have to put more rules in place. But in a family thing, you can get by because there's a trust inside the family more often than not. And then there's also spiritual capital. So I think those pieces. So many times when people talk of family wealth, they focus on the financial side, but there's these three other dimensions which are potentially bigger, if not equal to, than just the financial piece of the puzzle. So I just wanted to pause there and see if you had any reactions to this little chart, Emerson.
Well, yeah, it just confirms what I thought. Family business has got too many moving parts. Um, and I've joked on this podcast before that I've learned the lesson the hard way about not going into business with your friends. I've never gone into business with family, and maybe I learned my lesson dipping my foot in the water a little. But no, you brought up a point, and I'm going to go back to this, and that is the spiritual element, because I think that really gets overlooked. And I think that is an element, at least again, I'm just speculating here as somebody who's got a little bit of experience with work and stuff, but that could get very easily lost in a big organization. And I know one of the things that really works well in our little company is that we all are aligned in a way that we see beyond the work. There is a bigger purpose to what we do. I think we all in our office see that, and so that's a very motivating thing. That unites you on a different level. And so I guess that was going to lead me to kind of the last point I wanted to get to, because I know you've got a plane to catch, and that is heartfulness. Because to me, if I got an opportunity about a year ago to participate in the heartfulness journey. And I'm just kind of curious as to maybe you could elaborate on that as a way to kind of tie all this together into something meaningful, if that makes sense.
So I think there are three points to mention. One is, if you think of what is the purpose of starting a business. I mean, yes, it's a way to initially it's to create value because there's a dream you have and you want to make a change, and then it becomes an ATM machine that is providing for a certain set of people, and not only their family but also the employees that work there. But the real reason to start a business is to help people evolve, and I think that's sometimes, and I and more, I think most of the education now is shifting towards that, is to elevate the human consciousness because people spend most of their waking hours inside these different environments, and if they just come back, like a squeezed lemon or you know being put through the grinder, that doesn't do the world any good. So there's a shift in consciousness, and you can see things like conscious capitalism and other kinds of movements that are coming out there. But Adizes, I think, has been at the heart of this thing right from the get-go, which is why I think I got attracted to it in the first place, which is how do we create environments where the most desirable naturally occurs. So that's part of the Adizes approach to navigating, because it's not about just making more money or making a better business, but creating the conditions where you can actually free the prisoners and allow peoples to evolve as human beings. I think that's vital. And then along the way, Emerson, I was doing this Adiza stuff, and my brother discovered this thing called heartfulness. It's a meditation-based practice, and we were meditating, and life was good. So, and I told him, look, I don't need to switch to this. He was saying, this is hot stuff. You should check it out. And for 2 years, I didn't buy till a ship came to San Diego, and he gave me this 4-page article to read. And in the article, my jaw just dropped because what I was seeing was I was seeing Adizes for the human spirit. So heartfulness, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm coughing. But Adizes does helps the organizations free the human potential in a collective way. And heartfulness was almost a mirror image of the things we do to help organizations. And I could see a one-for-one correlation between the Adizes approach and how we would trigger this for our own souls. And the next day I was in, and that was, I think, 2002. So it's been again 20 years, and it's been just an adventure. And it's one of those things where you help people. It's about the human spirit and the human evolution, which allows people to evolve in a more natural way. There's no strict dogma. It's because everything we need is already given to us, and we just need to uncover what it is. And the best part was it was a systematic approach and doesn't require, the high priest, where you outsource your spiritual development to somebody else, which is what most religions do. Here you can take charge of that and do it in a family setting rather than going, in some places, if you go to India, the people, they go off and run away from the family and sit under a tree, or some other people do other things. But how do you integrate your spiritual development and make it an integral part of daily life? And whether it's work, whether it's family life, whether it's anything you do. So it was very invigorating for me to discover this. And like I said, it's been a 20-year journey, and I am still intrigued. I'm still learning this, and I'm still a novice at this, but it seems to be working. So for folks that might want to look at this, it's a very unknown thing. It's always there's no marketing done around it because you have to almost discover this by yourself. Similar to Adizes, most people don't really know Adizes, but the people that find it, get tremendous value and benefit. So so we don't want to use marketing as a way to drive the flock in, but when people discover it, I think they get somewhat surprised, and then each one approaches it from their own perspective.
I know from my experience doing that, it's what, about a 10 week, 9, 10 week, kind of once a week thing with the work in between. But I think the part I took out of it, I mean, aside from, I just enjoyed collaborating with people all over the globe. I really enjoyed, Mandeep. That guy's great. I just, that's a guy I just would really like to spend more time getting to know. But, he had these groups, and you just would talk and analyze and you learn. And there's just something to be said. I mean, I know this sounds pretty basic, but just being able to have an honest, you know, uh, communication with people and express your views without feeling like either A, you're not being politically correct, B, you're going to get attacked, C, you're going to, I mean, it's like, you know, it's almost like the freshness of just having a conversation where everybody can talk and just, brainstorm whatever. And I enjoyed the meditations that started that. I thought that was just, it really was good. And I guess that's maybe what I found in our office is that we do bring prayer into it. We do bring, our office has got pictures of Christ on it because we can, uh, but it's just to set a tone. It's an environment we want to create that brings peace when people walk in, whether they're, you know, that's the other thing I found is people aren't, whether they're Christian or Jewish or whatever, they don't really, there's an energy that's created that you want to bring to people. And I really appreciate what you said about allowing people to evolve as human beings. That's a higher level of an objective of any business and company. And like I said, some of the books I'm reading, I mean, clearly that was, if you think about, when people look at how do we improve our business? It's like cutting expenses. I don't think spirituality ever even gets on the balance sheet. I mean, it's, you know what I mean? It's like you bring that up in a boardroom and people are going to look at you like you're high and, anyway.
Well, I think but there are three energy forces. So there's the head, the hands, and the heart. And the heart can move very rapidly. So from an efficiency standpoint, and again, and people I think are waking up to this idea. And if you can engage the heart in the right sequence, you need all three. You need the head, you need the hands. But we've actually ignored the heart from the business side more often than not. But when you do engage it, the the results are just mind-boggling. And at least that's our experience. And many people once they taste that, they won't let go of it. So I feel very hopeful because I think there's a larger and larger movement towards this direction.
No, I agree. So listen, Sunil, I could talk to you forever. You're just one of the good guys in the world, and I'm glad that our paths crossed. If people want to get a hold of you, particularly business owners that might be listening or watching, where's the best way to reach out to you?
Oh gosh. Well, it's Sunil at Adizes.com. That's the fastest way. But there's a website. I mean, Adizes is Adizes, and that's so our office. Even though I'm sitting in Colorado, my our real office is sitting is in Mexico. It's in Monterrey, Mexico, and we have a again, a phenomenal team. Just like you've built Emerson, we've got a team, but it does phenomenal work. And I think we had a dinner last week where some of our clients came to attend this dinner, but not because, uh, and they came because they wanted show their support, because we were trying to help another university understand this Adizes stuff. And we gave them the theory and they said, look, don't listen to us. Listen to the people who are practicing, who adopted this methodology. And it was so gratifying to see. I mean, I gave out invitations, and everybody was eager to come, because not because they had to come, and these are all CEOs of businesses, and they came because they felt part of this particular thing. So Adizes is not something. Yes, it's a set of tools, it's a set of concepts, but what happens over time is you're inspired by it, but then you make this system your own, and all these businesses that had tropicalized it and made it their own, and they felt it was theirs, but then they wanted, and they were freely sharing with others how they benefited from it, and it was amazing, because in that room there were people that basically had about collectively, say, 10,000 employees that were present, and then if you imagine each family is got an average of four, so there were about 40,000 people impacted by this thing, and that was very gratifying to see, because it was not about, yeah, they're making good money, but they also are better humans, and they take care of the community. They're well integrated, and they are so it's not either or, it's an and many times if you can tap into the human potential, we can create exponential results. So, and that I think is the missing link which we're trying to bridge.
I appreciate that, and to the limited exposure I've had, it's been enough to change the way I think about certainly people we bring into the firm, but also just our purpose. And I think if there's anything to be said, just the fact that mind shift has occurred in my firm, I think that's a win, because it's certainly made us better people, but also just a better company for people. And I'm enjoying it. I think bottom line is I love what I do, and the people that I work with love what they do. And it's just, it's a good place to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, but thank you for this invitation. And I'm glad we could pull this off. And again, as I said in the beginning, we're like missionaries. So anybody we can help along the way, we'll be happy to serve this dish up, because it's a pretty good dish.
No, 100%. I can attest to that. So, Sunil, thanks for joining me today on Upthinking Finance. I appreciate it.
All the best, Emerson. Thank you.
Emerson Fersch is a registered representative with and securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA, SIPC. Advisor services offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor and separate entity from Capital Investment Advisors. The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision. The guest speakers and the companies they represent are not affiliated with or endorsed by LPL Financial or Capital Investment Advisors. Individual tax and legal matters should be discussed with your tax or legal expert. Economic forecasts set forth may not develop as predicted, and there can be no guarantee that strategies promoted will be successful. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. There is no assurance that the techniques and strategies discussed are suitable for all investors or will yield positive outcomes. The purchase of certain securities may be required to affect some of the strategies. Investing involves risks, including possible loss of principal.